Chapter 17 of The Dragon and the Raven by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. The Dragon and the Raven by G.A. Henty. Chapter 17, A Long Chase. The following morning the weather was still and dull. Not a breath of wind ruffled the surface of the river. "This is unfortunate," Edmund said to his companion. "Sweyn's galleys will row faster than we can go with oars alone, and though they may not know the Dragon, they will be sure that she is not one of their own ships. We must hope that they may attack us." The day passed on without a sight of the galleys, but late in the afternoon they were seen in the distance. The Dragon was moored near the middle of the river. Her oars were stowed away, and the crews ordered to keep below the bulwarks, and hoping that the Danes, seeing but few men about, and taking her for an easy prize, might attack her. When they approached within half a mile, the Danish galleys suddenly ceased rowing. "What is that strange looking vessel?" Sweyn asked the Northmen standing round him. "I know her," one of them said, "for I have twice seen her before, to my cost. The first time she chased us hotly at the mouth of the Thames, destroying several of the vessels with which we were sailing in convoy. The next time was in the battle where King Alfred defeated us last year, nearly in the same water. She is a Saxon ship, wondrous fast and well handled. She did more damage in the battle than any four of her consorts." "Were it not that I have other game in view," Sweyn said, "we would have fight her, for we are 2 to 1 and strongly manned, and the Saxon can scarcely carry more men than one of our galleys. But she is not likely to be worth the lives she'd cost us to capture her. Therefore we will e'en let her alone, which will be easy enough. For see that bank of sea fog rolling up the river. Another 10 minutes and we shall not see across the deck. Give orders to the other galley to lay in oars till the fog comes, then to make for the left bank of the river and to drift with the tide close inshore. Let none speak a word, and silence be kept until they hear my horn. I will follow the right bank till we reach the mouth." Freda was standing near and heard these orders with a sinking heart. She had no doubt that Edmund was on board the Saxon ship, and she had looked forward with confidence to be delivered from her captor. But now it seemed that owing to the evil change of the weather the hope was to be frustrated. Edmund and the Saxons had viewed with consternation the approach of the sea fog. The instant it enveloped the ships the oars were got out, and they rowed in the direction of the Danish vessels, which they hoped would drop anchor when the fog reached them. Not a word was spoken on board the Dragon. Edmund, Egbert, and Siegbert stood on the forecastle, intently listening for any sound which would betray the position of the Danes, but not a sound was to be heard. They had, they calculated, already reached the spot where the Danes should have been anchored, when from the left, but far away astern, a loud call in a woman's voice was heard. "That must be Freda," Edmund exclaimed. "Turn the ship, they have passed us in the fog." The Dragon's head was turned, and she rowed rapidly in the direction of the voice. No further sound was heard. Presently there was a sudden shock which threw everyone onto the deck. The Dragon had run high on the low muddy bank of the river. The tide was falling, and although for a few minutes the crew tried desperately to push her off, they soon found that their efforts were in vain, and it was not until the tide again rose high 9 hours later that the Dragon floated. Until morning broke nothing could be done, and even when it did so matters were not mended, for the fog was still dense. The disappointment of Edmund and Siegbert at the escape of the Danes was extreme. Their plans had been so well laid that when it was found that the Dragon had arrived in time no doubts were entertained of the success of the enterprise, and to be foiled just when Freda seemed within reach was a terrible disappointment. "My only consolation is," Edmund said as he paced the deck impatiently side by side with Egbert, "that this fog which delays us will also hinder the Danes." "That may or may not be so," Egbert answered. "It is evident that some on board the Danish ships must have recognized us, and that they were anxious to escape rather than fight. They draw so little water that they would not be afraid of the sandbanks off the mouth of the river, seeing that even if they strike them they can jump out, lighten the boats, and push them off. And once well out at sea it is probable that they may get clearer weather, for Siegbert tells me that the fog often lies thick at the mouths of these rivers when it is clear enough in the open sea." When the tide again began to run out, Edmund determined at all risks to proceed to sea. The moorings were cast off from the shore, and the Dragon suffered to drift down. Men with poles took their stations in her bows and sounded continually. while at her stern 2 anchors were prepared in readiness to drop at a moment's notice. Several times the water shoaled so much that Edmund was on the point of giving orders to drop the anchors, but each time it deepened again. So they continued drifting until they calculated that the tide must be nearly on the turn, and they then dropped anchor. It was much lighter now than it had been in the river, but it was still so misty that they could not see more than 100 yards or so round the vessel. No change took place until night, and then Edmund, who had been too excited and anxious to sleep on the previous night, lay down to rest, ordering that he should be woke if any change took place in the weather. As the sun rose next morning the fog gradually lifted, and they were able to see where they were. Their head pointed west. Far away on their left could be seen a low line of coast. Not a sail was in sight, and indeed sails would have been useless, for the water was still unruffled by a breath of wind. The anchors were at once got up and the oars manned, and the ship's head turned toward the shore. 2 hours' rowing took them within a short distance of land, and keeping about a mile out they rowed to the west. The men, knowing how anxious was their leader to overtake the Danish galleys, rowed their hardest, relieving each other by turns, so that half the oars were constantly going. Without intermission they rowed until night set in, and then cast anchor. When the wind came, it was not until the 3rd day. It was ahead, and instead of helping the Dragon it greatly impeded its progress. So far they had seen nothing of the galleys, and had the mortification of knowing that in spite of all their efforts these were probably gaining ground upon them every day. Even without wind the galleys would row faster than the Dragon, and being so fully manned would be able to keep all their oars going, but against the wind their advantage would be increased greatly, for lying low in the water they would offer but little resistance to it, and would be able to make way at a brisk pace, while the Dragon could scarcely move against it. The Saxon ship was off Calais when the breeze sprang up, and as it increased and their progress became slower and slower, Edmund held a consultation with his companions, and was determined to run across the channel and lie in the mouth of the Thames till the wind turned. So long as it continued to blow they would lag farther and farther behind the chase, who might, moreover, enter any of the rivers in search of shelter or provisions, and so escape their pursuers altogether. Siegbert had never been up the Mediterranean, but he had talked with many Danes who had been. These had told him that the best course was to sail west to the extremity of England, then to steer due south until they came upon the north coast of Spain. They would follow this to its western extremity, then run south following the land till they came to a channel some 10 miles wide, which formed the entrance of the Mediterranean. They decided therefore to follow this course in hopes of interrupting the galleys there. They would thus avoid the dangerous navigation of the west coast of France, where they were known to be many islands and rocks, and around which the tides ran with great fury. For a fortnight the Dragon lay windbound, then came 2 days of calm, and then, to their delight, the pennon on the top of the mast blew out from the east. They were lying in the mouth of the Colne, and would therefore have no difficulty in making the foreland, and with her sails set and her oars out, the Dragon dashed away from her moorings. Swiftly they ran round the south-easterly point of England, and then flew before the breeze along the southern coast. On the 3rd day they were off Land's End, and hauled her head to the south. The east wind held. The Bay of Biscay was calm, and after a rapid voyage they sighted the high lands of Spain ahead. Then they sheered to the west till they rounded its extremity, and then sailed down the coast of Spain. They put into a river for provisions, and the natives assembled in great numbers on the banks, with the evident intention of opposing a landing. But upon Egbert shouting that they were not Danes but Saxons, and were ready to barter for the provisions they required, the natives allowed them to approach. There was no wrangling for terms. Cattle were purchased, the water tanks filled up, and a few hours after entering the river the Dragon was again under way. Rounding the southern point they followed the land. After a day's sailing they perceived land on their right, and gave a shout of joy at the thought that they had arrived at the entrance of the straits. At nightfall they dropped anchor. "What are you looking at, Siegbert?" Edmund asked, seeing the Jarl looking thoughtfully at the anchor chain as the ship swung round. "I am thinking," the Jarl said, "that we must have made some error. Do you not see that she rides just as we were sailing, with her head to the northeast? That shows that the current is against us." "Assuredly it does, but the current's a very slack one, for the ropes are not tight." "But that agrees not," Siegbert said, "with what I have been told. In the first place, this channel points to the northeast, whereas I have heard the straits into the